To start off, I want to apologize in advance for how long this story is. I want to be clear that I don't care whether people believe it or not. Honestly, if I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't either. This happened about 3 years ago during my postgraduate studies. My research focused on Aboriginal communities, and my field placement was in a small town called Raymond, located in Arnhem Land, a remote area bordering the massive Arafura swamp. The swamp is one of the wildest places in Australia. Imagine an enormous stretch of decaying forest, flooded with stagnant, foul-smelling water, where crocodiles are a real danger. My accommodation was basically an old shack at the swamp's edge, technically outside the town, a few miles down a dirt road. It was an abandoned country house, and I had it completely to myself. Out back was a veranda overlooking the dark swamp. The view at dusk was beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. Surrounded by eucalyptus trees and silence, I didn't know a single person out there. I won't lie, those first few weeks were rough. It was the most alone I'd ever been, living in an old, rusted tin house in the middle of nowhere. But humans adapt. Before long, I started fixing up the place in my free time, planting a few seeds out front and chopping small trees for firewood. I remember the pride I felt felling my first tree, even though it took hours. When I sold the wood in town, I pretended it had taken half the effort. The locals were used to hard labor. It was a culture shock visiting homes with no television, let alone a computer. People weren't exactly poor. Some had more than others, but there was a shared choice to live apart from mainstream society. For instance, there was a strict alcohol ban in the region, so I was sober for the entire year I stayed there. And no, before anyone suggests it, I wasn't drunk or high when this happened. The first month was difficult but strangely refreshing. I adjusted to doing physical work, something I'd never done before. The swamp smell became less overwhelming over time. At first, the constant bird and insect noises kept me up at night, but I gradually learned to tell each sound apart, and eventually found comfort in them. Twice, I even heard a crocodile's deep roar near the house. By the second month, I'd fully adjusted to the isolation, spending long stretches of time alone in the bush. It was during that second month that something strange happened, though I didn't think much of it at first. One warm afternoon, I was sitting on the veranda reading, when I suddenly noticed how quiet everything had become. The usual background chorus of birds and frogs had completely stopped. All I could hear was the faint sound of a breeze and my rocking chair creaking. A cold wave rushed over me. My skin tingled. My bones felt frozen and dizziness set in. I stood up, thinking I might faint. And that's when I saw it. A few meters away stood a thin white tree, bare, branchless, rising upright beneath a pair of taller trees. I'd seen it many times before, but in that instant it twitched violently, shuddering like it was having a seizure, then went still again. No other tree moved. I stared for a long time, confused more than afraid. Eventually, the sounds of the swamp returned, and warmth flowed back into my body. I convinced myself it must have been a trick of the light, and soon forgot about it. Over the following weeks, I became friendly with a local school teacher and started spending weekdays teaching at the education center, which meant less time at the house during daylight. In the evenings, I'd sit on the veranda, smoke a bit, and read until darkness settled over the swamp. Seasonal changes weren't dramatic in that region, mostly humid all year, but I noticed a surge in insects. Crane flies, or as locals called them, daddy longlegs, were everywhere, sometimes forming huge clouds at dusk. They grew unnervingly large, big enough that their wings made an audible rustling sound as they brushed past each other. They didn't scare me, but they definitely put me on edge. Especially at night, using the outdoor toilet. Cramped, dark, and filled with giant flying bugs bumping into me. Another problem was these barnacle-like creatures that clung to the wooden steps and walls after rain. They weren't exactly frightening, but their growth was disturbing. A fisherman told me to scrape them off with a metal paint scraper, and the process was disgusting. Their reddish, fleshy bodies smelled horrible when removed. Still, life went on. I kept the place tidy, chopped trees to sell, and cleared weeds. But as the wet season shifted, more debris started washing up along the waterline. Plastic bottles, old trash, and natural litter. One morning, while cleaning the shoreline, I happened to glance toward that same white tree and froze. It was gone. The spot where it had stood was now empty. At first, I thought I'd mistaken its location, but after pacing back and forth along the bank, I was sure the tree had been right there. All day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I drove home that evening, I dreaded returning to the house. I even tried to convince a few friends to visit, but they said they'd come on the weekend instead. That night, I was alone. Lying in bed, I heard a slow creaking sound, like an old pole swaying just outside my window. I'd heard noises before, but this one was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate, followed by a distinct tapping on the glass above my head. Tap, tap, tap. There were no trees near that window, no branches that could have brushed against it. I tried convincing myself it was the gutter, or maybe one of those huge crane flies hitting the pane, but I couldn't move. I lay frozen, pretending to be asleep, until the tapping slowly faded away. When I finally looked, nothing. I forced myself to believe it had been something ordinary, and eventually drifted off. The next morning was unusually bright and heavy with heat, the kind of thick, humid warmth that clings to everything. That entire day, in my memory, feels faded and sun-soaked, like an old photograph left too long in the light. When I first got up, it seemed like any other day. The events of the previous night and the missing tree had already started to feel distant and unreal. The swamp shimmered under the sun. The leaves seemed dusted with gold, and the air was filled with bird calls. I even spotted a few wading birds out hunting frogs or lizards. After a few too many cups of coffee, I grew restless and decided to get outside. From the window, I noticed debris floating along the waterline again, so I grabbed a bucket and went out to clean it up. As I moved along the shore, I noticed something half buried in the mud, a waterlogged book, thick and bound, covered in silt. Curious, I picked it up, shook off the mud, and opened it. It turned out to be an annual business journal, a compilation of articles and reports. Near the back, there was a list of scholarship recipients, and there, printed in black and white, was my name. I've told this story to only a few people, and they usually brush off this part, saying it's just a coincidence, which, rationally, it probably was. But in that moment, it felt unreal, like reality had folded in on itself. Finding my own name in a random, half-rotted book at the edge of a swamp, thousands of miles from home, made my skin crawl. I set the book aside in a pile of junk. He was half hidden behind a tree, not entirely concealed, but partly obscured, as though he wasn't sure whether he wanted to be seen. His clothes were faded, brownish gray, blending into the background, but his face and arms were pale, standing out sharply in the light. Before I could process what I was seeing, he raised one arm and waved. It wasn't threatening, just a slow, deliberate wave. I waved back, uncertain what else to do. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. Feeling uneasy, I gestured vaguely toward my house, trying to signal that I was leaving. He waved again, still motionless. So I turned and walked back slowly, trying not to show how rattled I was. When I finally glanced back, he was gone, moved off into the trees. I locked every door when I got inside. The heat was suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to open the windows facing the swamp. I sat down, trying to calm my nerves, telling myself it was just some local out for a walk. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a flicker of movement beside me, a shadow shifting on the wall. I turned my head and nearly screamed. A face was pressed up against the window. The man leaned back quickly, raising both hands as if to calm me. He called out, saying he didn't mean to scare me, that he hadn't realized anyone lived here. He said he'd seen me by the swamp earlier and was just curious about who I was. He asked if he could come in. My instincts screamed no, but I heard myself say yes. I opened the door. He stepped inside slowly, smiling, polite, extending his hand for a shake. He introduced himself, though I didn't catch the name. His skin was weathered and tanned, his clothes caked in dust. But what unsettled me most was his face, the way it seemed slightly mismatched to his body, younger somehow, like his features didn't quite belong. He stood near the doorway, smiling but saying little. To break the silence, I offered him some coffee. He nodded, said, "Sure," and sat down. When I told him a bit about my work and studies, he didn't really respond. He just smiled vaguely and began talking about himself instead. He said he lived up north, spent most of his time in the swamp living off the land, farming a little, fishing, hunting. But his thoughts seemed scattered, sometimes trailing off into gibberish, his speech rough and uneven. Then, out of nowhere, he laughed. A sudden sharp burst, and asked loudly, "You got a girl here?" I froze, unsure how to respond. Before I could speak, his expression changed completely. His voice turned harsh. "Is there a girl here, mate?" he demanded again. I shook my head quickly. His grip tightened on the edge of the table, and then, just as suddenly, he relaxed, smiled again, and kept talking as if nothing had happened. It was the most unnerving conversation I'd ever had. After a while, he stood up, thanked me for the coffee, which he hadn't even touched, and walked out. Before disappearing down the slope toward the swamp, he turned back and said, "Couldn't keep a girl safe here anyway, not with all them bloody worries around." The term worries was an old, offensive word used by settlers to describe Aboriginal people. No one local used it anymore. I was shaken. I locked up again, grabbed my laptop and essentials, and drove straight into town. Outside the school, I ran into another teacher. She could tell something was wrong and asked about it. When I told her about the strange man, she just smiled knowingly. "Did he scare you?" she said. "He's mischievous but harmless, if it's him." She went on to explain that years ago, a man fitting that description had lived nearby. He was once a friendly, well-liked local, sold vegetables and homemade jam with his wife. They were a kind old couple, loved by everyone, but when his wife passed away, he took it hard. At first, people felt sorry for him, but then he started insisting she wasn't dead. He'd wander into town saying she'd gone missing, begging people to help him look for her. When someone finally told him the truth, that she'd been buried just outside town, he broke down, devastated. After that, he was never quite the same. He began ranting that locals had taken his wife, claiming a nearby tribe was keeping her captive in the swamp. He grew paranoid, bitter, and eventually stopped coming into town altogether. Over the years, people only saw him occasionally, hunting alone or muttering to himself in the wetlands. He became a kind of ghost story, the mad old man of the swamp. Hearing that, I felt a strange mix of fear and pity. Maybe he really was harmless, just a broken man living with grief and delusion. Still, I didn't want to go back that night. Eventually, though, I did. By the time I got home, dusk had deepened into darkness. Something felt different. The air was heavier, and the shadows seemed thicker than usual. When I checked the windows facing the swamp, I saw them covered in those barnacle-like creatures again. clumped together, pulsing slightly under the glass. The sight made my stomach turn. I grabbed the scraper and went outside with a flashlight, determined to clean them off. They were stuck hard, and when I finally pried them away, each one came off with a crack, leaving splinters in the wood and releasing a sick, rotten smell. By the time I finished, it was fully dark. The silence around me felt absolute, so quiet that every tiny sound stood out. A drop of water, a rustle of leaves, the faint creak of the veranda under my feet. That feeling, the one I'd felt before, returned. The sense that someone or something was watching me. I swung my flashlight toward the tree line, fast enough to catch any movement. Nothing. Then slowly, I scanned the bank.
At first, everything looked normal, just the twisted trees and low brush. But then, my light caught on something pale. A shape, hunched, vine-covered, half wrapped around a large conifer trunk. I focused the beam. For a moment, I thought it was just a dead tree, until it moved. In one quick, jerking motion, the shape pulled itself back behind the tree. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the sound, the loud, splintering creak of wood, and the unmistakable noise of something large moving through the brush. That was all it took. I ran inside, slammed the door, and locked every bolt I had. And that's where the story ends.